Greetings. We thank you for staying tuned to our channels. Just subscribe so that you can be able to watch the other videos. In this particular episode, we'll be talking about instrumental music. We know many places today we see people worshiping with different sets of instruments. Some play, some dance, some use different types of play. So which one is the acceptable method for worshiping? Which way is good? Do we play instruments in worship? Or is it okay to sing without instrument? Which one is correct? Some people will say David played instruments. So today we'll be looking at instrumental worship. And so to begin, we will look at firstly, instrumental music in the Old Testament. The first time we come across instruments is in the book of Genesis chapter 4, verse 21. When Jubal, a descendant of Cain, is introduced as the father of those who played instruments. From there, we are able to see other people that are connected with instruments. Also, when you look at the Bible, we will see that the Israelites, when they were rescued from the Egyptians, Miriam gathered the women and they sang with timbrels, they played, they danced because they were excited. Apart from that, there are other occasions where musical instruments are used. For example, they were used for calling an assembly. You can find that in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verse 11. They were used for commands in battle. You can find that in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 4. You can also find that they were used for the worship of false gods. You can find that in the book of Daniel, chapter 3 and verse 5. They were used as entertainment or for celebration. You can find that in Genesis chapter 31 verse 27. They were used to give honor to the king. You can find that in 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 34. They were used as a calming agent. You can find out in 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 23. We remember when King Saul was mad or was filled with the evil spirit, David then was invited to play for him so that the evil spirit will leave. So musical instruments then were used as a calming agent to calm down the nerve. They were also used in the worship of God. We'll find that in the book of Psalms 150. Now, the association of instruments with worship begins early in the history of God's people. Now, we already find that when the Israelites were released from captivity, what happened? Miriam gathered the people and together they sang and they dance. You find that in Exodus chapter 15 from verse 20 to 21. Now, centuries later, when the ark of God was being removed from the house of Abinadab, what happened? David and all the people played music before the Lord on all kinds of instruments. You find that in 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 5. And so when we continue to go down, what do we see? Musical instruments have been used for various purposes in the Old Testament. You also find out throughout the Psalms, David makes mention of praising God with instrumental music. Now, through the instruments, music was used for worship in the Old Testament. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us in a very simple way that musical instruments were used for various purposes. God allowed it in the Old Testament. He permitted them because maybe there were reasons he did that. Just as he allowed the people to worship, to stay with two women. Solomon had 1,000 and he lived with them. There were a lot of people who practiced polygamy and it was allowed, it was permitted. So instrumental music was allowed in the Old Testament. The people will worship and they will play and they will listen and they will dance. Even the false gods did the same. Now, today, we'll be talking about today in our next episode. Is instrumental music acceptable for worship today? Are we permitted to go back like David and play instruments when we worship God? Are we allowed to beat drums, to dance, to clap when we worship God? Are we allowed like Miriam to gather and play the timbrels and sing and dance? Are we allowed today in the worship of God? What does the Bible say? What does the Bible tell us? What does the Bible instruct? The Old Testament, we remember, God gave the law strictly to the Israelites, and we cannot find a precise place where he gives them an instruction on what to do concerning their singing or their dancing. And so that is why when Jubal introduces it, it continues in that way. David brings it. Miriam brings it, and they just keep going. And that is why from the beginning also, when God created man, Adam, he gave him only Eve. But when you discover later, people start marrying 2 women. They start living with 2, marrying 100, even 1,000. And God doesn't say anything. Now, so God allowed them. But today, is there a decent law? Is there a strict cut that God wants us to worship? We will be looking at that in our next episode. What we want you to understand is instrumental music in the Old Testament was at liberty. People did what they wanted. It was not only for playing, it was not only for singing, it was not only for worship. We have said it was used to call an assembly. When the people needed to gather, the people will use it. You know, there was something called the Feast of Trumpets. They will blow trumpets. This was part of the instruments that were used. When Miriam and the rest came out of the Egyptian captivity, they played, they danced. And so in other occasions, they were used. They were used to inform the people. They were used to maybe tell the king. They were used to honor the king. They were used to calm down as calming down agents. All these things were used. Instrumental music were used in that time. But today, what are we supposed to do? In our next episode, we'll be looking at instrumental music, whether it is permitted in the worship of today. If it is not permitted, what are we supposed to use today? We'll be looking at that in the next episode. Thank you very much for your time.